The rifle butt cracked against my ribs with a sound like breaking kindling, and I stumbled forward into the man ahead of me. His skeletal frame barely held him upright, and when I grabbed his shoulder to steady myself, I felt nothing but bone wrapped in fever-hot skin. Around us, the jungle pressed in like a green wall, indifferent to our suffering, while the Japanese guards screamed commands in a language that had become the soundtrack of our nightmare. My name is Staff Sergeant Tommy Nakamura, and I'm about to tell you how I walked 65 miles through hell and somehow lived to remember every step. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been dug into a foxhole on the Bataan Peninsula, clutching my M1 Garand and watching the Japanese artillery tear our positions apart piece by piece. We'd been holding that godforsaken strip of jungle for 3 months, living on quarter rations and hope, waiting for the reinforcements that General MacArthur had promised, but that we all knew weren't coming. I was part of the 31st Infantry Regiment, one of the Filipino units that fought alongside the Americans. My father had immigrated from Japan to the Philippines in 1920, married my mother, a beautiful Filipina from Zambales, and built a small life growing rice. When the war came, I didn't hesitate. This was my country now, and I'd be damned if I'd let anyone take it without a fight. But by April 1942, we weren't fighting anymore. We were dying. The malaria had gotten to most of us. My buddy Carlos Santos, who'd grown up fishing in Manila Bay, was burning up with fever, talking to his dead mother in Tagalog. Private Johnson from Iowa couldn't keep anything down and had lost so much weight his uniform hung on him like a scarecrow's clothes. We all had dysentery, and the smell of our own sickness mixed with the stench of rotting bodies that we couldn't spare the men to bury. On April 8th, Colonel King made the decision that saved our lives and condemned us to a different kind of hell. He sent up the white flag. I'll never forget the moment I saw those Japanese soldiers walking toward our lines. They looked fresh, well-fed, their uniforms clean despite the jungle humidity. They carried their rifles with the confidence of victors, and their eyes held something I had never seen before, a cold contempt that went beyond military necessity. Hands up. All hands up. The officer who spoke English had a thin mustache and wore glasses that reflected the afternoon sun. Behind him, soldiers with bayonets fixed began herding us together like cattle. You are prisoners of Imperial Japanese Army now. You do as we say, or you die. That was when I got my first taste of what was coming. A Japancesa soldier, not much older than my 22 years, walked up to Sergeant Martinez, who was limping from shrapnel wounds. Without warning, the soldier drove his bayonet into Martinez's stomach. The sergeant doubled over, gasping, and fell backward into the mud. The Japanese soldier stepped over his body and kept walking, whispered Private Johnson. They just killed him. They just killed him for nothing. Shut up, I hissed. Don't give them a reason. But I was learning that with these guards, there didn't need to be a reason. They gave us 10 minutes to gather whatever we could carry. 10 minutes to grab what remained of our lives and prepare for a journey that none of us understood. I stuffed my canteen with the last of our purifying water, grabbed a handful of crackers that were probably older than the war, and said goodbye to the foxhole that had been my home for 3 months. Where do you think they're taking us? Carlos asked. His fever had broken, but he still looked like death warmed over. Prisoner camp, probably. Somewhere up north. I tried to sound confident, but the truth was, I had no idea what the Japanese planned to do with 75,000 prisoners of war. In all my training, nobody had prepared us for this. They lined us up in columns of 4, hundreds and hundreds of us stretching back as far as I could see. American soldiers, Filipino scouts, Philippine Army regulars, even some civilians who'd been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. We were a ragged army of defeat, and the Japanese guards made sure we knew it. The march started at dawn on April 10th. The first thing I noticed was the heat. Even at 6 in the morning, the tropical sun was already brutal, and by noon it would be a furnace. The second thing I noticed was the pace. The guards didn't walk, they jogged, and they expected us to keep up. Move! Move! No, stop! The guards ran alongside our columns, prodding anyone who fell behind with bayonets or rifle butts. Within the first hour, I saw 3 men collapse from exhaustion. The guards didn't help them. They didn't even slow down. They just left them where they fell. The road from Bataan wound north through some of the most beautiful country in the Philippines. Under different circumstances, I might have admired the rice paddies stretching out toward distant mountains, or the way the morning mist clung to the jungle canopy. But all I could focus on was putting one foot in front of the other and trying not to think about the growing ache in my legs. By the 3rd hour, men were starting to fall behind regularly. The Japanese had a simple solution. Anyone who couldn't keep up was eliminated. I watched a guard casually shoot a Filipino soldier who'd stopped to vomit. The man pitched forward into a drainage ditch, and we marched past his body without breaking stride. "Don't look," I told Carlos, who was struggling beside me. "Don't give them the satisfaction." But how could you not look? How could you not see the bodies starting to accumulate along the roadside like mile markers of suffering? By noon, the sun was a weapon pointed directly at our heads. The Japanese guards had hats and water, but we had nothing. My mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton, and every breath was an effort. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes and soaking what remained of my uniform. That's when I saw the first man break. His name was Lieutenant Parker, a young officer from the 192nd Tank Battalion. He'd been walking about 20 yards ahead of me, and I'd been watching him struggle for the last hour. His steps were getting shorter, his shoulders were sagging, and he kept shaking his head like he was trying to clear cobwebs. Suddenly, he stopped. "I can't," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I can't do this anymore." A Japanese guard was on him in seconds. But instead of shooting him, the guard began screaming in Japanese and hitting Parker with the butt of his rifle. Parker fell to his knees, then onto his side, and the guard kept beating him. Other guards joined in, kicking and stomping, until Parker stopped moving. Then something happened that I'll never forget as long as I live. The guard who'd started the beating stood up, looked directly at me, and smiled. It was a message. This is what happens to anyone who gives up. This is what happens to anyone who shows weakness. This is what happens to anyone who thinks their suffering matters to us. I understood then that this wasn't just about getting us from point A to point B. This was about breaking us. This was about destroying not just our bodies, but our spirits, our hope, our humanity itself. "Keep walking, Tommy," Carlos whispered beside me. His voice was steady, but I could see terror in his eyes. "Whatever happens, keep walking." The cruelest part wasn't the lack of water, it was the abundance of it. On the second day, we passed through a village where artesian wells bubbled up from the ground, crystal clear and cool. I could hear the water flowing, could smell its freshness in the air. My tongue was so swollen I could barely swallow, and my lips were cracked and bleeding. The guards let us stop for exactly 30 seconds, just long enough to see what we couldn't have. "Please," begged a soldier from the 200th Coast Artillery. He was from New Mexico, and he hadn't stopped talking about his wife and 2 daughters since the march began. "Please, just a sip." The guard smiled and poured water from his canteen onto the ground at the man's feet. The water soaked into the dusty road and disappeared. Some men broke ranks and tried to reach the wells. I watched 3 Filipino soldiers get bayoneted before they made it 10 steps. Their bodies fell into the mud, mixing their blood with the water they died trying to reach. But there were moments of grace too. Brief, shining moments when humanity flickered back to life in that hell. A Filipino woman, old enough to be my grandmother, stood by the side of the road as we passed it through her village. When the guards weren't looking, she tossed rice balls wrapped in banana leaves to us. A few landed near my feet, and I managed to grab one without breaking stride. That rice ball, probably worth a few centavos, was the most precious thing in the world to me at that moment. I shared it with Carlos and Johnson, and the three of us chewed slowly, savoring every grain. God bless her, Johnson whispered. Whoever she is, God bless her. The woman caught my eye as I passed, and she pressed her hands together in a small bow. In her eyes, I saw something that the Japanese hadn't been able to kill: compassion. On the third day, they introduced us to what they called the sun treatment. At the hottest part of the afternoon, when the temperature had to be over 100 degrees and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning, the guards stopped the march. They forced us to sit in an open field with no shade, no water, no relief from the blazing sun. This is rest, announced the English-speaking officer. You rest here for 1 hour. Men began dropping within minutes. The combination of dehydration, malnutrition, and the brutal sun created a perfect killing machine that required no bullets, no bayonets, no effort from our captors. They could simply watch us die. I closed my eyes and tried to find some place in my mind where the sun couldn't reach. I thought about my mother's garden behind our house in Zambales, how cool it was in the early morning when the dew still clung to the vegetables. I thought about fishing with my father in the Zambales River, standing in the shade of mango trees while the water flowed over my feet. Tommy. Carlos's voice was barely a whisper. Tommy, I don't think I can make it. I opened my eyes. My friend, who had been strong enough to carry wounded men during the fighting on Bataan, looked like a skeleton. His eyes had sunk deep into his skull, and his skin had turned a yellow color that meant his liver was failing. Yes, you can, I said. You're going to make it because you're Carlos Santos, and Carlos Santos doesn't quit on anything. My kids, Tommy. My kids in Manila. If I don't make it, you're going to see your kids again. I reached over and grabbed his hand. His skin felt like paper, but his grip was still strong. We're both going to see our families again, but only if we keep going. Around us, men were beginning to hallucinate from the heat. Some talked to people who weren't there. Others laughed hysterically at invisible jokes. A few stood up and tried to walk away, only to be shot down by the guards. When the hour was over, maybe 40 men didn't get up. They would never get up again. On the fourth day, we reached the Pantingan River. I could smell the water before I could see it, that clean, fresh scent that meant life itself. My body started moving faster without conscious thought, pulled forward by an instinct older than thought. But as we crested the hill and saw the river below us, I also saw something that made my heart sink. Hundreds of men were already there, crowded along the banks, and Japanese guards were positioned every few yards to make sure nobody drank without permission. They were using water as a weapon of control. You may drink for 2 minutes, announced the officer. Anyone who takes longer will be shot. 2 minutes. After 4 days of walking through hell with almost no water, they were giving us 2 minutes. The stampede nearly killed more men than the march itself. Soldiers who could barely walk suddenly found the energy to run, desperate to reach the water before time ran out. Men fell and were trampled by their own comrades. The Japanese guards laughed and pointed, enjoying the spectacle of our desperation. I reached the water's edge and plunged my face into the river. It was muddy and probably contaminated, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever tasted. I drank as fast as I could, trying to store as much water as possible in my dehydrated body. Around me, men were drinking like animals, some lying flat in the mud to get their mouths closer to the water. A few were so excited that they drank too much, too fast, and started vomiting immediately. Time, shouted the officer. Guards began pulling men away from the water by their hair, by their arms, by whatever they could grab. Some soldiers kept drinking even as they were dragged away, trying to steal a few more seconds of life. Carlos had managed to fill his helmet with water, and we shared it as we were forced back into formation. The metal was hot from the sun, but the water inside was still the most precious thing in the world. How much farther? He asked. I looked up the road, where it disappeared into more jungle, more hills, more suffering. I don't know, but we've made it this far. On the 5th day, we reached the railroad tracks that would take us north to Camp O'Donnell. The march was almost over, but the Japanese had saved one final torture for us. The train cars were made for cattle, not humans. Each boxcar was designed to hold maybe 20 animals, but the guards packed 40 prisoners into each one. There was no room to sit, no room to lie down, barely room to breathe. They sealed us inside. The heat inside those boxcars was indescribable. Within an hour, the temperature had to be over 120 degrees. Men began fainting immediately, but there was nowhere for them to fall. We were pressed so tightly together that unconscious men were held upright by the bodies around them. The smell was worse than the heat. 40 men who hadn't bathed in months, many of them sick with dysentery, many of them with untreated wounds that had become infected. Add to that the stench of fear, of desperation, of bodies beginning to shut down, and you had an atmosphere that was barely breathable. I can't breathe, gasped a young soldier pressed against my back. God help me, I can't breathe. Yes, you can, I told him. Slow breaths. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Just like we're back in basic training. But men were dying around us. I could feel bodies going limp, could hear the rattle of final breaths. And there was nothing we could do. We couldn't help them, couldn't even lay them down with dignity. We could only stand there and witness their deaths. The train ride lasted 6 hours. When they finally opened the doors, 17 men in our car had died. The Japanese guards looked at the bodies with the same expression they'd used to examine broken equipment. Inconvenient, but not surprising. They dragged out the dead and threw them in a pile beside the tracks like cordwood. Welcome to Camp O'Donnell, said the English-speaking officer. This is your new home. Camp O'Donnell had been a Philippine Army training facility before the war, but the Japanese had converted it into a death camp. Surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, it sprawled across several acres of red dirt and misery. They divided us immediately, Americans in one section, Filipinos in another. It was the first time in days that I'd been separated from soldiers I'd been fighting alongside, and somehow that separation felt like another small death. The barracks were long, low buildings that might have housed 30 men comfortably. The Japanese packed 100 prisoners into each one. There were no beds, no blankets, no protection from the insects that swarmed through the buildings at night. But for the first time in almost a week, we were allowed to stop walking. I collapsed onto the wooden floor and felt my legs cramp immediately. Carlos fell beside me, and we lay there for a long time, just grateful to be horizontal. We made it, he whispered. Tommy, we actually made it. Around us, other survivors were having the same realization. We had walked 65 miles through hell. We had watched friends die, had seen cruelty beyond imagination, had been pushed far beyond the limits of human endurance. And somehow, we were still alive. But the victory felt hollow. Of the 75,000 men who'd started the march, more than 10,000 had died along the way. And looking around at the scarecrow figures lying on the barracks floor, I wondered how many more would die in the weeks and months to come. The next 18 months in Camp O'Donnell taught me things about survival that no military training could have prepared me for. I learned that the human body can survive on rice and salt when that's all there is. I learned that hope is more important than food, and that giving up is a choice you make every single day. Carlos and I made a pact that first night in camp. We would not die here. Whatever it took, however long the war lasted, we would survive to see our families again. It wasn't easy. The Japanese guards were just as cruel in the camp as they'd been on the march. Men died every day from disease, malnutrition, and simple despair. The burial detail was always busy, but there were moments of grace here too. Filipino civilians sometimes threw packages over the fence, rice, dried fish, even letters from the outside world. American and Filipino prisoners shared what little they had, took care of each other's sick, and maintained the military discipline that gave structure to our shattered lives. I learned Japanese curse words from listening to the guards, and eventually picked up enough of the language to sometimes understand what they were planning. That knowledge saved my life more than once. Carlos got sick with malaria in the second month, and for 2 weeks I thought I was going to lose him. I traded my only pair of socks for quinine pills from a Navy corpsman, and sat beside Carlos's bunk every night, wiping the fever sweat from his forehead and making sure he kept breathing. When he recovered, he did the same for me. That's how we survived. Not as individuals, but as brothers. On January 30th, 1945, nearly 3 years after the march, American tanks rolled through the gates of Camp O'Donnell. I was in the camp hospital, recovering from a bout of dysentery that had nearly killed me, when I heard the first rumble of engines. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But then other prisoners began shouting, and I heard a sound I hadn't heard in 3 years. American voices speaking English with confidence and authority. Whispered the man on the cot next to me, "They're here." I struggled to sit up and look out the window. Coming up the main road of the camp were 3 Sherman tanks, followed by trucks full of soldiers wearing the uniform of the United States Army. They looked impossibly young, impossibly clean, impossibly well fed. The Japanese guards had fled during the night. The camp gates hung open, and for the first time in almost 3 years, there was no one to stop us from walking through them. But most of us were too weak to walk anywhere. The soldiers who liberated us were kids, really, 18 and 19 years old, probably fresh from the States. They took one look at the skeletal figures stumbling toward them, and several of them started crying. "My God," said a young lieutenant who couldn't have been older than 21. "My God, what did they do to you?" Carlos, who'd managed to make it to the window beside me, actually laughed. "They tried to kill us," he said, "but we're still here." They flew us to a hospital in Australia first, then to Hawaii, and finally back to the mainland United States. The journey took 3 weeks, and every day I felt a little more human. The hardest part was eating. After 3 years off near starvation, my stomach couldn't handle normal food. I'd dream about steaks and hamburgers, but when they put them in front of me, I could only manage a few bites before getting sick. The doctors said it would take months, maybe years, for my body to fully recover. But they also said something else. I was lucky to be alive. Of the 75,000 men who'd started the Bataan Death March, fewer than 30,000 had survived the war. Those numbers should have felt like a victory. But all I could think about were the faces of the men who didn't make it. Sergeant Martinez, bayoneted on the first day. Lieutenant Parker, beaten to death for showing weakness. The 17 men who'd died in our train car. The hundreds I'd watched fall by the roadside. I'm an old man now, telling this story more than 70 years after it happened. My children are grown. My grandchildren have grandchildren of their own. The world has moved on, and the war in the Pacific has become a chapter in history books. But I remember every step of that march. I remember every face, every moment of cruelty, every small act of kindness. I remember because it's important that someone does. People ask me if I hate the Japanese for what they did to us. The honest answer is complicated. I hated them then, hated them with a fury that kept me alive when nothing else could. But Haiti's a heavy thing to carry for 70 years, and eventually I had to put it down. What I've learned is that the march wasn't really about the Japanese and Americans, or even about the war. It was about something more fundamental, what human beings are capable of doing to each other, and what we're capable of surviving when we have to. The guards who tortured us weren't monsters from another planet. They were men who'd been taught that we were less than human, that our suffering didn't matter, that cruelty was not only acceptable, but required. In different circumstances, with different training, They might have been the ones helping us instead of hurting us. And we prisoners, we weren't those. We were just ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, trying to survive one more day, one more hour, one more step. Some of us found reserves of strength and courage we never knew we had. Others broke under the pressure and did things they'd never imagined themselves capable of. But here's what I want people to remember. We survived. Not all of us, but enough of us. We survived because we helped each other. We survived because we refused to surrender our humanity, even when our captors had surrendered theirs. We survived because we believed, even when belief seemed impossible, that we would see home again. Carlos made it through the war and went back to his family in Manila. We kept in touch for 40 years, writing letters every Christmas, sharing pictures of our children and grandchildren. When he died in 1987, his son sent me a letter saying that Carlos had talked about our friendship until the very end. He said you saved his life, the son wrote. But he also said he saved yours. He was right on both counts. The Bataan Death March was one of the worst atrocities committed against American and Filipino forces during World War II. It was a war crime that violated every principle of human decency and military honor. The men responsible were eventually tried and punished, though that justice came too late for the thousands who died. But it was also something else, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In the face of unimaginable cruelty, men found ways to maintain their dignity, their compassion, and their hope. They took care of each other when they could barely take care of themselves. They shared their last sips of water, their last bites of food, their last reserves of strength. And they survived to tell the story. I've told this story to my children, to my grandchildren, to anyone who would listen. Not because I want them to know about the horrors of war, but because I want them to know about the power of human endurance. I want them to understand that no matter how dark things get, no matter how hopeless the situation seems, there's always a choice to keep going. One step at a time. One day at a time. One breath at a time. That's how you walk through hell and come out the other side. That's how you survive when survival seems impossible. That's the lesson of Bataan.